Parents kicked me out because of my sister's pregnancy. Now, they're reaching out a year later to mend things. But I've moved on, realizing that being rejected forced me to forge my own path and find true independence. Despite their regrets and pleas for reconnection, I've built a life free from past hurts, and I'm not willing to reopen that painful chapter. Almost a year ago, I was forced out of my home at 19, just weeks after turning 18, right in the middle of my high school finals. With nowhere to turn, I was incredibly fortunate that my best friend and her parents welcomed me into their home, a kindness I will never forget. The reason behind my eviction was that my older half-sister, Sasha, was pregnant, and my parents believed she needed to return home for proper care. Sasha isn't even my full sibling. She came about when my mother was dating my stepfather, Jacob, during her college years. After my mother unexpectedly became pregnant a few months before graduation, she chose not to marry Jacob, as it was just a brief relationship. However, Jacob was determined to be a responsible father, so he and my mother co-parented Sasha. Later on, when Sasha was 3, my mother met my biological father. They dated for 2 years and eventually married. But a year into their marriage, she found out she was pregnant with me. My father, unprepared for fatherhood, wanted to terminate the pregnancy, but my mother refused, and soon after, they went their separate ways. Following his abandonment of my pregnant mother, she cut off all ties with him and his family before reconnecting with Jacob. By the time I was born, my father had already passed away, and my mother and Jacob raised me together. They married a few years after her divorce was finalized, yet I never felt that Jacob treated me like a member of the family. He always made me feel like a burden. While I shared a close bond with my mother, both Jacob and Sasha consistently made me feel like an outsider, despite my many attempts to connect with them. As I grew older, I began to see the truth. I was never truly part of Jacob and Sasha's inner circle. It shouldn't have been a surprise when, around a year ago, Sasha, who was 6 years my senior at 24, announced just 2 days before finals that she was expecting. Although she and her boyfriend, who had been together since high school, lived in a modest apartment near our house, she felt unsafe being alone there, especially since she worked from home while her partner traveled frequently. Hoping to avoid loneliness and reduce expenses, she decided to move back with our parents. However, my parents declared that her return meant I had to vacate my own room. Sasha already had a room in the house, but after she left for college, Jacob had converted it into an office. With no alternative place for me to sleep, I was forced to sacrifice my room, a decision they urged me to see as a sacrifice for family unity. This conversation came at the worst possible time, just before my first exam, when I was already overwhelmed with a 2-week exam schedule. Their sole focus was on Sasha and her impending motherhood. I refused to leave, explaining that Sasha had never treated me like family and, therefore, I wasn't obligated to make a sacrifice for her. My parents tried to persuade me otherwise, but our discussion quickly escalated. Jacob eventually snapped, insisting that I leave by the end of the week, reminding me that as an adult, I had no right to stay at his house. I had hoped my mother would stand up for me, yet she sided with Jacob, insisting that there wasn't time to debate because they needed space for their real grandkids. That term confirmed what I'd felt for years. My mother, Sasha, and Jacob had built their own tight-knit family, leaving me permanently on the outside. Heartbroken, I began packing my things immediately, completely unaware that I had an exam the very next day. Their lack of resistance as I left revealed their true priorities. I eventually found refuge on my best friend's doorstep. When I explained everything, she and her parents welcomed me with open arms, promising I could stay as long as needed. Many wonder why I didn't turn to other relatives, but the truth is I have none. Jacob's family is just as unwelcoming as he is, and I knew that even reaching out would be futile. On my mother's side, her relatives had abandoned her when she became pregnant with Sasha. They had urged her to focus solely on her studies and had disapproved of her decision to continue with the pregnancy due to her young age. Not only were they absent during her wedding to my father, but they also never showed up for Sasha's birth or mine. Left without any family support, I turned to my friends. I always secretly hoped my mother would contact me eventually, but I never expected any warmth from Jacob or Sasha, who seemed relieved to see me go since I never fit into their ideal family. The most painful part was my mother's silence. After a few months, I stopped expecting any communication from her. Now, a full year later, I've learned that Sasha gave birth a few months back. She and her boyfriend, who continue to live with our parents, likely to save on rent, are busy celebrating their new roles as parents. Meanwhile, I have been focusing on rebuilding my own life. After graduating from high school, I had to navigate the challenge of pursuing college with minimal support and limited funds. While my best friend's parents generously allowed me to live with them without charge, I couldn't possibly ask them to fund my education, especially with their own children to care for. The pressure was immense, but thanks to my hard work, I secured a scholarship from one of the institutions I applied to. Even though it wasn't my first or even my second choice, I couldn't pass up the chance to save on expenses. All of this, the forced sacrifice of my room right before my first exam, the relentless focus on Sasha's needs, and the complete lack of support, only reinforced the painful reality that I was never truly part of their family. I refused to make any concessions on her behalf. My parents tried to convince me otherwise, but I felt their demands were completely unjust, and our conversation soon escalated into an argument. Eventually, Jacob snapped and insisted that I leave by week's end, warning me that, as a legal adult, he had the authority to decide who stayed in his home. I expected my mother to stand up for me, yet she chose to back Jacob. She explained that they needed extra space for their real grandkids and didn't have the time or energy to debate the issue. Hearing her label Sasha's children as real grandkids only confirmed what I had long suspected. My mother, Sasha, and Jacob had created their own little unit, and I had always been an outsider. Overwhelmed by despair, I began packing immediately, ignoring the fact that I had an exam scheduled for the next day. Their complete lack of resistance as I left made it clear where their loyalties truly lay. I eventually found refuge at my best friend's home, and after explaining everything, she and her parents welcomed me to stay as long as I needed. You might wonder why I didn't seek help from any other family members, but I really don't have any. Jacob's family has always disliked me, so reaching out to them would have been futile. I never knew anyone on my mother's side either. She always claimed that when she became pregnant with Sasha, her family cut her off because they wanted her to focus on her studies and didn't want her to have a child at such a young age. They weren't even present for her wedding, or for either of our births, according to her. With no relatives to turn to, I turned to my friends for support. After being forced out and moving in with my best friend's family, I continued to hope that my mother would eventually contact me. I had no such expectations for Jacob or Sasha. It was clear they didn't care about me and were likely relieved that I had left. What hurt the most was my mother's complete silence. After a few months, I had given up hope entirely. A year has now passed. Recently, I learned from friends that Sasha gave birth a few months ago, and she and her boyfriend have been posting about their new life as proud parents. They are still living with my parents, probably to save on rent, but I've grown indifferent to it all. I've been focusing on building my own future. After graduating from high school, I had to figure out how to attend college without any financial help from my parents. My best friend's family kindly let me live with them rent-free, but I couldn't expect them to cover my tuition, especially since they had their own children. I was nervous about the future, but fortunately, I had applied for several scholarships. Being a strong student, I managed to secure a scholarship that covered 60% of my tuition. It wasn't my top choice for college, but the opportunity to cut costs was too good to pass up. I ended up taking out a student loan as well, with my best friend's parents agreeing to co-sign. I promised them I'd work through school and pay off the debt myself, a promise I've been working hard to keep. Then, unexpectedly, about a week ago my mother emailed me, asking me to come home for the weekend. She claimed she missed me, and that Jacob and Sasha did too, expressing a desire to reconcile. Her message was unusually warm and sincere, but something felt off to me. I didn't reply. A few days later, she sent another email, which I also ignored. Despite my curiosity, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was another motive behind it. It seemed too convenient that they would suddenly feel remorse after an entire year. 2 days ago, I finally received a response from my maternal grandparents. I was shocked they had managed to reach me, as I thought my parents had never shared my information with them. They explained that they had tracked me down through one of my high school friends who had trusted them with my number. It turned out to be my best friend's information, and I was grateful for that surprise. When my grandparents called and FaceTimed me, I couldn't believe it was really them. I had never known them, seen their faces, or heard their voices before. Although I was hesitant at first, they showed me old photo albums of my mother's childhood and teenage years, and slowly, I began to accept that they were my real grandparents. Emotions ran high as we talked, and I shared details about my life, while carefully avoiding discussion of my parents, though they already seemed to know everything. They explained that one major reason they hadn't reached out before was because of my parents. Only recently had they uncovered the truth. I was confused, as my mother had always claimed that my grandparents had disowned her when she became pregnant with Sasha. That was all I had known. But my grandparents clarified that they never opposed my mother having Sasha. Instead, they disapproved of her relationship with Jacob. My mother had misrepresented the situation to protect Jacob's image. They had supported her through her pregnancy and even offered financial help, on the condition that she end her relationship with Jacob. They feared his influence, knowing his background all too well, as he was a well-known addict from our hometown, having attended the same high school and college as my grandparents. They had promised my mother financial support during and after her pregnancy, but only if she cut ties with Jacob. After much deliberation, my mother ended their relationship because Jacob couldn't get his life together. In fact, my grandparents even took full custody of Sasha when she was born, leaving Jacob with only visitation rights in the early years. Although Jacob later managed to finish his degree and get clean, he relapsed intermittently, so my grandparents never fully trusted him. They even introduced my mother to my biological father, the son of a family friend. After dating on and off for a few years, my mother eventually married him, having lost hope that Jacob would ever change. Yet, it seems she never entirely let go of Jacob. About a year into her marriage, she had an affair with him and became pregnant again. Forced to confront the truth, she eventually told my father about the affair. That revelation led to her divorce from him and her subsequent marriage to Jacob. Everything my mother had said about my father's reluctance to have me was a lie. After I was born, multiple paternity tests confirmed that I was my biological father's daughter, not Jacob's. A relief, as I never wanted to be seen as Jacob's child. Although my father briefly had partial custody of me, I barely remember it because it was so long ago. Tragically, my biological father died in a car accident when I was only 7 months old, leaving my mother free to continue her deceptions. His family, too, refused any further contact after his death, which, in a way, worked in my mother's favor. My grandparents were deeply disturbed when they learned of my mother's affair with Jacob. They gave her an ultimatum: either completely cut Jacob out of her life and commit to her marriage with my father, or face permanent estrangement from them. My mother chose Jacob, as he had maintained a longer period of sobriety than before, and that was the final major disagreement between her and my grandparents. At the time, my mother was still pregnant, and she and my grandparents didn't communicate again until after I was born. Eventually, my grandparents softened and decided to reach out so they could meet me, but Jacob refused to cooperate and form a happy family with them, citing past grievances. My mother refused to accept their attempts at reconciliation. My grandparents, however, persisted in reaching out to her every few months, but she consistently shut them out. This continued for years until financial hardship struck. Jacob and my mother couldn't pay the rent. With nowhere else to turn, my mother reached out to her parents. In a generous move, my grandparents provided her with a house, hoping it would mend their relationship. About 6 years ago, our family moved into this new home, a significant upgrade from our previous apartment. I always wondered how my parents could afford such a lovely property in a sought-after neighborhood, considering my mother worked as a receptionist and Jacob was in sales, with his company struggling. Now I realized it was all thanks to my grandparents. Even so, my ungrateful parents never made any real effort to rebuild their bond with my grandparents. Both my mother and Jacob knew full well that my grandparents had paid for the house, yet my mother claimed they needed more time to reconnect. My grandparents, ever hopeful, waited for a few months, but when my mother continued to delay, they tried again. She kept insisting she needed more time. This went on for years until my grandparents finally admitted that maybe it wasn't meant to be. Growing older, they confessed how humiliating it was to repeatedly reach out to their daughter only to be turned away. Eventually, they told my mother that they understood why she didn't want them around and even regretted not being more gentle in the past. All they ever asked for was that she continue sending photos of our family so they could see we were doing well. Surprisingly, my mother agreed. For the past few years, that became the only way my grandparents stayed in touch, a bittersweet arrangement. They shared everything with me, and I couldn't help but cry. I had always seen them as the villains, but now I saw a different side. The way they uncovered the truth was unexpected. My grandfather had a heart scare, and both he and my grandmother realized they couldn't keep pretending everything was fine as they were getting older. They decided to make one final attempt to reconcile with the family before it was too late. A few weeks ago, they stopped by my mother's house, which is technically still theirs because they paid for it, and their names remain on the deed. My mother had no choice but to welcome and entertain them. They proudly embraced their roles as great-grandparents when Sasha had her children. However, when they inquired about me, my parents grew noticeably uneasy and stumbled for an explanation. They told my grandparents I was away at college, suggesting it wasn't a good time to reach out because I was vulnerable with exams looming. They couldn't even come up with a convincing fake college name, which made my grandparents suspicious. They had a gut feeling that something was off, so they left the house to speak with our neighbors. That's when they discovered I hadn't been living with my parents for the past year since I was kicked out. The neighbors were unsure of the details, but their son, who attended school with me, filled in the blanks. That's how my grandparents got in touch with my best friend, and eventually, they learned everything that had happened to me. Understandably, they were furious upon discovering the truth. They informed my mother that she and her family needed to vacate the house to make room for their only real grandchild. It felt like ultimate payback, using the same tactics my parents had once used on me. My best friend made sure my grandparents knew exactly how to hit that nerve. It became clear that my parents' attempts to reach out were simply an effort to avoid losing their home. After learning everything, my grandparents waited a few days before approaching me, worried about my reaction. In the end, they decided to move forward since they had wasted so many years fretting over my mother's response, and they wanted to do what was right. They also wanted to give me the freedom to decide for myself. They told me that if I wanted to give my family another chance, they could continue living in the house. If not, they would proceed with the eviction. When they arrived, no one else in the family seemed happy to see them, and I was the only one genuinely interested in forging a relationship with them. My grandparents refused to be taken for fools any longer, so I had to decide whether I wanted my parents to keep their home or not. To be honest, part of me wanted them gone, though it felt harsh. Now, what if I told my grandparents I wanted my family evicted? Update 1. Hello, and thank you for all your encouraging words. It means more to me than I can say. After much thought, I decided that I do want my family to leave the house. I told my grandparents a few days ago, and now they are in the process of evicting them. Of course, there's a lot of legal paperwork involved, but my grandparents assured me I wouldn't have to worry about it. My parents have also been emotionally manipulative, especially Sasha, but my grandparents are impervious to it. After our conversation, they learned about all the lies my mother had been telling and how she had poisoned their grandchildren against them. They have no sympathy left for my parents. To be honest, Sasha and her partner are mature adults, and I'm confident they'll manage just fine, just like countless others. The same goes for my parents. I don't feel any guilt about it. After all, they didn't feel any remorse for kicking me out when I was just 18 and still in school. Even though it happened right before my exams, I managed to perform well academically. I urged my grandparents not to worry about my college tuition, but they insisted on handling the student loan. They also apologized for not being there for me sooner. We have a lot to discuss and work through, but things are going well now. Update 2. Hello again. My grandparents began the eviction process a few weeks ago, and my family has until the end of next month to leave. My mother isn't happy about it. A few weeks back, she sent me an email trying to rebuild trust and heal things, most likely in an effort to avoid being kicked out by her parents. However, this email was very different from the ones I received before. It was full of curse words and bitter sentiments, including her saying she wished she'd never given birth to me and even that she wished I had been in the vehicle accident with my father so we might have both died. That's my mom for you, but it no longer affects me because I no longer consider her family. Honestly, my only family now consists of my grandparents, my best friend and her parents, and a few relatives my grandparents are introducing me to. My mother severed ties with them long ago because she didn't want any contact with her own family. Update 3. Hello, the holidays have just started, and I'm back in my old home. It's strange being here again, but my grandparents have been living in the house since my family left, and they've done an excellent job renovating it. Even my room now feels like home once more. We're hosting a Thanksgiving dinner soon and have invited some family members, my best friend and her parents included. It feels like my life is finally coming back together, and I'm incredibly happy. I wish it could last forever. Thank you for watching. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do and hit the notification bell for more real-life stories that might shock you.